I somehow recently found myself in a bookstore that specializes in like old and rare texts. Honestly, this feels like the type of place where I could have went into the back and found some old ancient scroll that's like a spell book that would release the end times. They had a lot of random text just strewn about, and as a person with an English degree, this is my heaven. But I wasn't there just for any book. I saw on their social media that they posted that they had the Magic the Gathering official deck builder's guide, 120 deck lists for players of all levels, by Tim Dedopoulos. Just look at this thing. Look at the top tiers of cards they've decided to show off with this. Starting on the left, we have Force of Will. Okay, multi-format all-star. This card has been reprinted a couple times and it's still $60. It's a counterspell that you can play for free. Our next card is Undiscovered Paradise, which is a land that can tap for any color but bounces back to your hand once you use it. It's on the reserve list, so it's like $15. But I feel like if it was printed today, it'd be a common or uncommon. I don't even think they would print it today. And then the one lone creature is Black Knight. It's a 2/2 for 2 with first strike and pro white, which nowadays this has been printed like in Magic 2011. And even then it was only like a common or uncommon, and it only sits at like 15 cents. I think this cover alone has showed how much Magic has changed. They weren't completely sure how to make fair, balanced cards yet. Like 1 mana draw 3 cards was the equivalent to 1 mana deal 3 damage to someone, which was also the equivalent to 1 mana gain 3 life. White really didn't get the fair end of the stick on that cycle. Spells like instants and sorceries, mana sources and interrupts were really broken at the time, but creatures and lands weren't. The deck that won the World Championship in 1994 had 4 of Sarah Angel. This was a completely different era of Magic the Gathering. So when we look into this, we need to look at it with a historical perspective. See, I'm not some dumb guy with an English degree, I also have a minor in history. The first deck that I randomly flipped to, and not because it was just on page 69, was for a deck called Permafrost. Remember when decks had cool nicknames? People need to bring that back. They give a quick breakdown. It's a tournament deck. It has black, red, and green. The strategy is land destruction. The cost is fairly low. It's tournament legal in Ice Age block. And the card count is 60 in the main board and 15 in the sideboard. Which after some light investigation, that is a blatant lie. There are 61 cards in the main board. What are you trying to pull, Tim? We have a deck list and a little bit of a blurb, so allow me to read the blurb while the deck list comes up on the screen. If you haven't made use of blue for counter magic, one of the better ways of slowing an opponent down is to knock her off her lands. This deck combines land destruction techniques from black, green, and red with damage potential from each. Land destruction comes in the form of Ice Quake in black, Thermal Karst in green, and Stone Rain in red. Furthermore, black's Moleworms will act as a surrogate land destruction, keeping a land tapped for as long as they are around. For damage, black provides Horshade. One of the pumpable creatures in black, Horshade gets steadily more dangerous as the game progresses. As a substitute for direct damage, it works relevantly well. Green provides Folk of the Pines, again a creature that can have its power increased with an upper limit save mana. And Shambling Strider, dangerous enough untampered with, but it too can have its power boosted, albeit at the cost of toughness. Lava Burst provides genuine red direct damage. Being something of a mixture of different styles, this deck will seem rather slow to start with. You may take some damage in the early rounds before it really gets going. When it does, however, the combination of direct damage, line destruction, and relatively large creatures together provides a very strong impetus to the deck. You will find that a game which looked more or less helpless will often turn into a surprise victory as everything suddenly clicks into place. Now this deck just looks wild to look at. You have some cards that are in here that are still mentioned today, right beside cards that are long forgotten. These cards are so forgettable you probably wouldn't even play them in your limited decks. Like you have Fyndhorn Elves, which serves as an extra copy of Landwar Elves in a lot of commander decks. You have Stone Rain, which is a classic land removal spell. 4 of Dark Ritual, because even then they recognized how strong paying 1 black for 3 mana really is. And then you have Shambling Strider, who for 6 mana you get a 5/5 with bad fire breathing. Or Horshade, who is a 4 mana 1/2 with bad fire breathing. Or Folk of the Pines, who is a 5 mana 2/5 with still pretty bad fire breathing. Creatures just really sucked back then. Flipping around, I got around to like these different decks, but not just different decks, there seems to be whole formats that we've forgotten about and lost to time. We have Standard, which they commonly refer to as Type 2 in this book. Some familiar names come up here like White Weenie, Reanimator, Control, Counterburn. But then we also get stuff like Speed, Slight, Protected Damage, and Meta Weenie. And they have the format called Type 1, which in this it also refers to as Classic, but you might better know it now as Vintage. I really liked reading it in this part because it always referred to a deck by Classic blank. So while the text is referring to it as, oh, this is the classic version of this deck, it fits into the format Classic, it comes across that you're just referring to your old friend who's up to their classic shenanigans. Oh, Classic Abyss. Oh, Classic Direct Damage, up to their old shenanigans. Pan 1 mana, Bolting the Birds, you know, the classics. There are a bunch of decks here that are just commons. They don't have a format name attributed to them in this text, but you might better know that right now as Pauper. It's just kind of funny to see that even then they were trying to make a format work where it was just commons. There's a bunch of block constructed decks for Ice Age, Portal, and Mirage. This is definitely a style of format that has died off, even kind of recently. They had a Pro Tour as recent as 2014 with block constructed, but it was better suited then because block constructed you at least had 3 sets to work with. We don't really have blocks anymore, so you can't really do that. What really stood out to me in this though is there's decks that are made solely for multiplayer. Right now multiplayer seems almost synonymous with Commander, but even I kind of remember a time before Commander was as widespread as it is now, where you'd play a deck that maybe is legacy legal, like you technically count it as legacy legal, but it's just all the rares you own in a pile. We'd have like basically standard legal decks with just some extra jank going on. Actually, I remember there was a format that me and my buddies used to play called 5 Corners. You needed 5 players to play, and you won if the 2 players across from you lost. So with that, you were kind of with an alliance with the people on your side. It was a really weird format because you could still be alive and lose. The book discusses multiplayer, but only really dives into how it isn't touched by the DCI. Like the DCI never really gives any constraints to multiplayer, which I guess kind of reflects today with Rule 0 in Commander. Let's look at a random deck. I have the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Sadly, there isn't a Magic the Gathering creature that looks like Clint Eastwood. Until Wizards of the Coast are kind enough to remedy the situation, this big critter deck has had to focus on some of the more popular and cost-effective creatures used in the game. In this particular case, the good is of course the Serra Angel, still White's most popular large creature, despite no longer being part of the Type 2 environment. The role of the bad is taken on by our counterpart, the also missed Senior Vampire. The Ugly has to be played by Shivan Dragon, probably Red's highest profile monster. To help keep you relatively safe while you're waiting for the mana to cast the stars of your deck, there's a supporting cast of small creatures. White provides the Blinking Spirit, much hated by anyone who isn't playing White at the time. Black offers its own endearing flying weenie, Will-O-the-Wisp, and from Red we get the Dragon Whelp. Not a regenerator, but you can pump it up enough to finish off even the largest attackers. The deck is not entirely reliant on loosely themed creatures. Black and Red both provide some creature removal, and Blue is included purely for some counterspells. You should save this for cards that will ruin your strategy, specifically Armageddon and Creature Sweepers. When the mana becomes available, this deck will quickly pump out an impressive array of large creatures and leave you in a very strong position for the game. They mentioned counterspells and Blue, but this deck is strictly Mardu, so I don't know what they're on about. There's no Blue, there's no counterspells. It's funny when looking at the deck breakdown that they even recognize then that since this multiplayer format is going to go on longer, you should have bigger decks. So this deck has 67 cards, but I've seen some of these decks have like 70. This deck also labels itself as low costed, even though it includes 12 dual lands. I like looking at some of these and making direct connections between Magic now and then. Like the first multiplayer deck that it lists is called Blaster. And it's a red-white deck that deals with direct damage. And the write-up talks about how a main problem with red-white direct damage in a multiplayer format is that you will just get all your spells out right quick and then have nowhere to go. Which is exactly what Boros has been doing in Commander for a while and why they've had to make so many different ways to draw cards and ramp in white. We have a deck completely themed around a creature type. I'm a big fan of creature types. As of right now, I'm 50 videos into going into every creature type in alphabetical order. Now, when this book was published, there weren't too many creature types in Magic. You still had some of the classics like elves or goblins. So take a moment at home and guess which creature type they picked for this. You were wrong, it was chimeras. It's based around cards like Brass Talon Chimera, who you can sacrifice to make other chimeras bigger. You sacrifice it, it gets a +2/+2 counter. The good old days of Magic with non-standard counters. The deck essentially reads like a Voltron deck nowadays. Instead of making a board's worth of creatures all go wide, we're just piling all our resources onto one creature. The difference between Voltron and this is instead of having auras and equipments, we have a bunch of different chimeras. They all sacrifice themselves and give their power and their ability to the creature. It's funny that Tinwing Chimera says the creature gains flying. That's just permanent. It doesn't go away at the end of turn, but there's also no signifier. Like nowadays, it would get a flying counter. That's not here. One last multiplayer deck that I think is especially funny to bring up here is called Landlock. It's a very weird combo. It uses Living Plane to turn all the lands in play into 1/1s. And then Cursed Tome turns off all activated abilities, so those lands that just became 1/1s can no longer tap for mana. I said it was a combo, I didn't say it could actually win. You just chill there and play the grindiest game known to man. What's really funny about all these decks is that even the most zaniest ones have sideboards. Like that's something that's a big difference between Commander and older Magic. But now I'm willing to bet that a portion of even the audience that's watching this video don't know what a sideboard is or never have had to use a sideboard. I want to finish this video going over some of the more jokey decks or just really odd themed decks. I always thought this was a more recent thing to happen in Magic, you know, having decks that aren't built just to win. They're more built as like a piece of art, a thing that you've put together, and you could just happen to play Magic with them, but they aren't necessarily built to actually win. There are tons of decks based around artists in this. There are other decks based around creature types like the Chimera deck I mentioned before. Here we have goblins, dragons, merfolk, zombies. But most of the creature types it brings up are just half-baked block constructed decks for creature types like hominids. As a fan of weird creature types, I respect it. There's a section specifically called Stunt Decks that are really just out there. I'm a fan of Party at Mother's, which is a 5-color deck that runs one of most, if not all, legendary creatures that were out at the time. I also like Knight of the Ninja. Poison is a tantalizing concept in Magic the Gathering. To be able to deal a form of damage that none of the usual spells can prevent or heal, and one that only requires 10 poison to be dealt rather than 20, is certainly an interesting prospect. The main drawback of poison as a weapon is that the creatures that carry it tend to be rather expensive and therefore slow to get out and taken fairly seriously as a threat. It's very funny to see poison talked about then, how a lot of people talk about newer mechanics now. Everything is walking the line between either being unplayable or so broken it's gonna kill the game. And I think that's my main takeaway from reading this book. Magic has changed a lot in the last 30 years. Try showing someone back then a Universes Beyond card. But at its core, Magic has remained the same. Sure, power levels have changed, but people are still building decks that aren't meant to necessarily win, are more so just meant to have fun. Back then, they were still building decks for multiplayer formats, even if Commander or something else wasn't recognized by WotC. People still looked at new mechanics in Magic with hopeful skepticism. People still looked at cards and said, that's so cool, I'm gonna build a whole deck that's just those cards. This book has been a really cool pickup, and I've had a lot of fun looking over the different lists. The best part I have to say is that most of these deck lists include original duels throughout the mana bases, which I could only imagine that going down nowadays. As much skepticism as there is towards Magic in general right now, I think looking back has shown me that Magic right now has what it takes to move forward. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to bolt your birds.